Welcome to our sew along tutorial, where today we're diving into the delightful Emma dress pattern, a perfect blend of collegiate charm and casual sophistication. If you're a creative sewer eager to add a versatile and stylish piece to your wardrobe, you're in the right place. The Emma pattern comes with 3 options for you to choose from: a cropped vest, a skirt with ruffles, or the full dress with ruffles. Select your favorite and let's get started. By the end of this tutorial, you'll have a beautifully crafted piece that's sure to turn heads wherever you go. Start by measuring and cutting your interlining fabric, making sure it's an exact match to your collar and undercollar, front and back facing, flaps, and waistband. Gently place the interlining fabric on the wrong side of each facing piece and press the interlining onto the facing fabric with an iron. Lay your front bodice pieces on a flat surface. Start by positioning the center front bodice piece alongside the middle front bodice piece and the side front bodice piece. If you are confused, you will notice that the pieces have notches that will help you align them correctly. Start placing them right sides together, aligning the edges and matching the notches. Sew them together using a 1 cm seam allowance. Overlock the seam allowance and press it with an iron towards the sides. Next, lay your back bodice pieces on a flat surface. Start by positioning the center back bodice piece alongside the middle back bodice piece. Then, place the side back bodice piece next to the middle back bodice piece. As we did with the front pieces, place them right sides together, in the order mentioned earlier. Align the edges and match the notches. Sew them together using a 1 cm seam allowance. Overlock the seam allowance and press it with an iron towards the sides. Grab your front and back bodice pieces and double top stitch the seams you already sewed. Start from top to bottom, making sure to catch the seam allowance in the seam and that the top stitches are oriented toward the sides. Set up your sewing machine with a double needle. A double needle is a special type of needle that has 2 points, which allows you to sew parallel lines of stitching at the same time. If you don't have one at hand, don't worry. A normal needle would do just fine. Start the first top stitch at 0.1 centimeters from the seam and the second one at 0.5 centimeters. As you top stitch, make sure to hold the fabric taut and guide it through the machine, but be careful not to stretch or pull it. Fun tip: use contrast thick thread. Repeat for all bodice seams. Time to move on to the chest flaps. Take the flap pieces and pair them up, making sure the right sides are facing each other. Then, pin the 2 pieces of each pair together, ensuring that the edges align properly. I like to draw the seam allowance on the piece, so I can pivot the needle exactly where I am supposed to. Next, using a sewing machine, you'll sew around the 4 sides of each pair with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Just be sure to leave the top edge open so you can turn the flap right side out later. To reduce bulk, we'll carefully cut half of 1 seam allowance and triangle shape in the corners, making sure not to cut into the seam itself. Turn it through to the right side and give it a good press with an iron to make sure it's nice and flat. Then, you'll top stitch the flap around the 4 sides with a 0.1 and a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. This will give it a polished look and add some extra strength to the seams. I choose the do only the 0.5 centimeters top stitch because my fabric was too thick for the 0.11. Lay your front yoke piece right side up. Next, position the flap at the bottom of the yoke, right sides together, between the notches. Make sure those straight edges are aligned. Once everything's in harmony, go ahead and top stitch using a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. Ready to unite that front yoke and front piece? Place them right sides together, making sure that the edges are perfectly lined up and that the notches are matching. Sew in place using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Once you're done, give that seam a nice press upwards to keep everything looking crisp and neat, and overlock it. Last but not least, add that golden touch, a double top stitch. Sew one at 0.1 and one at 0.5 centimeters from the seam on the bottom of the yoke, making sure to catch that seam allowance too. Repeat with the back yoke and the back bodice pieces. Place them right sides together and align the edges. Sew in place using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Overlock the seam and press it towards the neckline with an iron. Just as we did on the front, we are going to double top stitch. Align the shoulder of the front and back bodice pieces, with right sides facing each other. Pin the two pieces together, making sure the edges align properly. Sew the shoulder edges together using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Press the seam flat with an iron and overlock. Let's attach the bias band to the armhole. Place the bodice flat on your surface and pin the binding around the armholes. Right sides. Stitch in place on the inner raw edge. I am using a wide bias band, but if your bias band is narrow, you might want to open one fold and sew on the binding indent. Fold the binding over to the wrong side of the armhole, hiding the bias band from the right side. Pin in place and continue to pin to the end of the binding. Starting at the one end of the armhole, sew along the armhole edge at 0.5 centimeters. Continue sewing all the way around until you reach the end of the armhole on the other side. Align the sides of the front and back bodice pieces, with right sides facing each other. Pin the two pieces together. Sew in place using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Press the seam flat with an iron and overlock. Then press the seam towards the back and sew a top stitch on the underarm at 0.5 centimeters to catch the seam allowance. Let's move our focus on the collar. Align the collar and undercollar with their right sides facing each other and pin in place around the side and outside edge. You will notice that the undercollar is slightly smaller than the upper collar. All you have to do is pull the undercollar to fit. The slight size difference helps the collar roll naturally towards the underside. Next, trim the seam allowance from the undercollar. Then, say goodbye to the surplus fabric at the corners. Once you've done that, turn the collar to the right side. Push out the corners using a sharp object. And for that extra touch of perfection, press the collar to form its final shape. Last but not least, it's time to top stitch all around the collar using a 0.5 centimeters seam allowance. If your fabric is not too thick, you can double top stitch. Place the back bodice facing and front bodice facing pieces with their right sides together, ensuring that the shoulder edges are precisely aligned. Sew along the shoulder edges to join the facing pieces. Press the seams open using an iron and overlock the inner edges of the final facing. Align the notches on the under collar with those on the bodice neckline edge and secure them in place with sewing pins, right sides together. Stitch the collar to the bodice along the pinned neckline edge, using a 0.5 centimeters seam allowance. Let's bring together your main bodice piece and the bodice facing. Place them with their right sides together. In the middle of this fabric sandwich, you'll have the collar. It's the star of the show, neatly tucked in between. Now, it's time to play matchmaker with all the notches and edges. Carefully align them. Double-check that everything is in harmony, with no puckers or mismatches. Once you're happy with the alignment, pin everything in place. Starting from one end, begin sewing all the way around the bodice's edges to attach the facing to the main fabric. Remember to use a consistent seam allowance. Staying on the path is key. After sewing, it's time to trim the excess fabric at the corners and snip into the round edges. Be cautious and gentle. You want to cut enough to help the facing lay flat when the dress is worn, but not so close that you threaten the seam's integrity. All right, it's time to turn your bodice right side out. Gently ease it through until everything is facing the right way. Now, let's give those seams some attention with your iron. Pressing is key here. Take your time and press each seam really well. It's amazing how a good press can transform your dress, giving it that sharp, professional finish. Sew a top stitch on top of the shoulder seam to attach the shoulder of the facing with the shoulder of the bodice. Align the shell fabric and the facing wrong sides together. Pin the outer edge of the back facing with the back bodice and sew a top stitch on the edge to keep them in place. Optional, you can sew a top stitch on the edge of the neckline, starting from the collar, at 0.5 centimeters. Your bodice is now ready. Take the loop piece and overlock one of the long sides to secure it. Next, fold the loop piece lengthwise into thirds and stitch down the overlocked edges to create a neat, uniform look. Finally, using the pattern as a guide, cut the loop pieces to the specified dimensions. Place the loops on the bottom of the bodice piece, aligning them to the side seams and the seam between the center piece and middle pieces. Top stitch in place using a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. Place the two waistband pieces right sides together and insert the bodice inside, with the bottom edge of the bodice sandwiched between the two pieces of the waistband. Align the notches on the waistband with the seams on the bodice, making sure the waistband is evenly distributed around the bodice. Secure the waistband pieces in position with pins, ensuring they align properly. Begin sewing at the center front edge, 1 centimeter above the bottom edge. Pivot at the corner, and continue sewing across the waistband until you reach the opposite center front edge. Cut the corners narrow and turn the waistband pieces right side out. Press with an iron. Top stitch on the waistband at 0.5 centimeter from the seam. Take care not to catch the loops in the top stitch. Now let's focus on our skirt pieces. Just as we did with the bodice pieces, lay the back skirt pieces on a flat surface. Match the center back skirt piece with the middle back skirt piece and the side back with the middle back. Place them right sides together, aligning the notch. Sew in place using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Repeat with the front skirt pieces. Match the center front skirt piece with the middle front skirt piece and the side front with the middle front. Place them right sides together, aligning the notches. Sew in place using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Overlock the seams and press them to the sides. It's time to double stitch the seams, just as we did on the bodice. Sew a top stitch at 0.1 and a second at 0.5 centimeters, taking care to catch the seam allowance. Next, position the center front edge of the facing precisely with the center front of the skirt, ensuring right sides are facing each other. Stitch them together using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. After stitching, press the seam open to ensure a smooth finish. Then, carefully fold the facing to the wrong side of the skirt and press once more. Secure the side edge of the front skirt facing with an overlock stitch. Align the sides of the front and back skirt pieces, with right sides facing each other. Pin the two pieces together, making sure the edges align properly. Sew the side edges together and press the seam flat with an iron. Overlock the edges. Grab the hem piece and you're going to fold the top part inward. It's a small fold, just 1 centimeter. Make sure to fold towards the wrong side of the fabric. Cut a small square of interfacing and place it on the ends of the hem piece. Press with an iron. Next, you'll need to fold the hem in half lengthwise, right sides facing each other. Sew it along the edges, using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Turn the hem right side out and push the corners out. Press the hem in half using an iron. Grab your outer hem piece and place it on the bottom of the skirt. They should be placed with their right sides facing each other. Once they're perfectly aligned, pin the two pieces together, making sure the edges are perfectly matched. Leave the inner hem edge unattached. Now, it's time to sew. Using your trusty sewing machine, join the bottom of the skirt to the top of the outer hem. Make sure to keep a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Carefully align the folded edge of the inner hem piece with the seam allowance where the outer hem and the skirt meet. Pin in place, ensuring that the seam allowance is inside. Apply a top stitch along the outer hem, making sure to include the seam allowance and the inner hem in the seam. Use a seam allowance of 0.5 centimeter. Place the skirt to the bottom of the outer waistband, making sure to match the notches, with right sides facing each other. Leave the under waistband unattached. Pin in place, matching the notches. Sew in place using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Take the under waistband and turn under the bottom seam allowance by 1 centimeter, so it is hidden on the inside of the waistband. Pin the under waistband in place around the top of the skirt. Use a flat top stitch to securely attach the under waistband to the hem edge. Sew at a distance of 0.5 centimeter from the edge. Fold the bottom of the loops 1 centimeter inwards and align the folded edge with the bottom of the waistband. Top stitch on the folded edge to fix the bottom of the loop onto the dress. Unfortunately, my fabric was too thick to sew on the folded edge, so I chose the align the edge with the bottom of the waistband. Let's add some beautiful top stitching detail to your dress. You're going to sew a top stitch 4 centimeters away from the center front edges. Think of it as drawing a neat line parallel to the edge, adding both strength and style to your dress. Mark the snaps positions. Grab your patterns and use them to mark where your snaps will go on the left button center front. Think of these markings as little X marks the spot, guiding you where to place them. Carefully attach the female snaps on each of the marked spots on the left center front. Take your time with this. If you can't use snaps, you can sew buttonholes instead. Add the male snaps of the left side of the dress. Time to sew the ruffle. Take the 3 hem ruffle pieces and place 2 of them right sides together. Then take the 3rd piece and align it with the other short edge. Pin in place and sew using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Press flat with an iron and overlock the seams, the bottom hem and the central front edges. Turn the bottom hem 2 cm inward to the wrong side. Sew a top stitch at 1.8 cm from the edge.
Perfect.
Then turn the center front edges 1 cm inwards to the wrong side and sew at 0.8 cm. Press the seams with an iron. Let's add some lovely gathers to the top edge of the hem ruffle piece. To create gathers, set your sewing machine to a long stitch length. Sew the first row of gathering stitches at 0.5 centimeters from the top edge of the front piece. Remember to leave long tails of thread at the beginning and end of the stitching. These tails will be useful for gathering the fabric later. Once the first row is complete, sew a second row of gathering stitches at 1.5 centimeters from the top edge. Again, leave long thread tails for gathering purposes. Begin by gathering the top edge of the ruffle to fit between the snaps previously added onto the hem of the skirt. I made a mistake here, so measure 2 centimeters from each central front edge. Distribute the gathers evenly along the width of the skirt hem. Next, take the bias band and cut it to the width of the ruffles. Add 1 centimeter on each side so we can fold the ends later. Unfold one folded edge and align the raw edge of the bias band with the gathered edge of the ruffle, right sides together. Sew the binding to the ruffle at 0.5 centimeters, ensuring that the raw edges are matched. Fold down the end of the bias band so that raw, short edges are tucked in. Then, fold the bias band over to the wrong side of the ruffle so that it wraps the raw edge of the ruffle. Starting at the end of one of the ruffle, sew along the folded edge of the bias band at 0.1 centimeter. Continue sewing all the way around until you reach the end. Prepare the braid trim with stretch loops. Measure the top of the ruffle and cut the braid to the same measurement. If you can't find the braid trim in stores, you can also use hand-sewn snaps to attach the ruffle to the skirt. Take the braid trim and fold each edge by 1 centimeter towards the wrong side. Now attach the braid trim to the top ruffle, wrong sides together, sewing a top stitch. Position 8-10 buttons evenly along the top edge of the inner hem piece, ensuring uniform spacing. Start placing the buttons at 2 centimeters from the center front edge, maintaining equal distances between each button. Secure each button firmly with hand stitches. These buttons will act as anchors for attaching the detachable ruffle.
And voila, your dress is ready.